I arrived in the city for a weekend getaway, hoping to escape the monotony of everyday life. The apartment I had booked was in a modern, sleek building right in the heart of it all. A trendy part of the city, surrounded by art galleries, cafes, and trendy boutiques. The location was ideal, central, quiet, and close to everything I wanted to see. The apartment was just as advertised. Everything about it screamed luxury. Fast Wi-Fi, large flat-screen TV, state-of-the-art kitchen appliances, and a full-length window that overlooked the bustling streets below. It was a high-rise with polished floors, sleek furniture, and the kind of minimalist decor that was meant to feel calming but looked more sterile than homely. Still, it was clean, well-kept, and functional. I settled in, unpacked my bags, and started to make myself comfortable. There was something about the place that felt almost too perfect, too curated. The bed was enormous, and the linens were soft, fresh, and smelled faintly of lavender. The bathroom was immaculate, with fluffy towels and a shower that had better water pressure than any hotel I had ever stayed in. It seemed like the kind of place you would go to for a relaxing stay, and for the first couple of hours, I was just enjoying the peace and quiet of the apartment, away from my busy routine. But by the end of my first evening, things began to feel a little off. It was subtle at first. As I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone, I caught a faint whiff of something floral. It was almost pleasant, like a bouquet of fresh flowers. I didn't think much of it at first. The window was cracked open a little to let in the cool evening air, and the street outside was lined with flower shops, so it could have easily been the scent from a nearby vendor or someone passing by with flowers in hand. But as the night went on, I noticed it again. The smell seemed to hang in the air like a faint perfume. It wasn't overpowering, but it was there, subtle, persistent, and just a little strange. I checked the apartment again, just to make sure there weren't any flowers hidden somewhere, or a perfume bottle that had been left open. Nothing. The apartment was as spotless as when I first arrived, and there were no obvious sources for the scent. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just my imagination or the lingering scent of something outside. The next day, the smell was still there, but I was too busy to pay it much attention. I spent most of the day out exploring the city, visiting museums, walking around, trying out some of the local food. By the time I returned that evening, though, the scent of roses was stronger, a little too strong. It wasn't just in the air. It seemed to have settled in every corner of the apartment. I opened the windows wide, hoping that a gust of fresh air would push the smell away. I turned on the ceiling fan and left the windows open while I took a quick shower, thinking that maybe it would help clear the air. When I returned to the main room, though, the smell was still there, persistent and almost oppressive. I couldn't help but feel like it was following me around, lingering wherever I went in the apartment. I called the host just to make sure everything was all right. I mentioned the smell, and they were quick to reassure me that there were no flowers in the apartment. None had been left behind, and nothing in the place should be emitting that kind of scent. I asked if maybe there was some sort of hidden perfume bottle or air freshener somewhere, but the host insisted there was nothing of the sort. They apologized for the inconvenience but assured me that they would look into it if I wanted. I hung up the phone, feeling uneasy. Maybe it was just some sort of weird coincidence. But the longer I stayed there, the more I felt like something wasn't quite right. That night, the smell grew even stronger, almost suffocating. I lay in bed, unable to sleep, the scent of roses filling the room, clinging to the sheets and the air around me. I tossed and turned, trying to get comfortable, but no matter how much I moved or tried to air out the room, it wouldn't go away. Around midnight, I finally got out of bed and turned on all the lights. I needed to know what was causing the smell. I checked the closets again, looked under the bed, and even examined the walls for any sign of something hidden away. There was nothing. No flowers, no perfume, no obvious source, just this odd, relentless smell of roses. It wasn't until I went to the kitchen to get a drink of water that I noticed something strange. In the corner of the room, near the large window, there was a shadow. It was faint at first, just a darkening in the corner of my vision. But when I looked directly at it, it became more defined. It wasn't a figure or a person, but more like a shape, a slight outline of something standing in the corner. I blinked, and the shadow seemed to disappear just as quickly as it had appeared. The room felt cold suddenly, despite the warm air blowing through the windows. I stood there for a long time, staring into the corner, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the smell of roses persisted, now even stronger than before. It was so overwhelming that I could taste it in the back of my throat. I left the kitchen, retreated back to the bedroom, and locked the door behind me. I couldn't explain it. There was no logical reason for any of it. No flowers, no hidden perfume, just the overwhelming smell of roses and that fleeting shadow in the corner of my vision. The next morning, when I woke up, everything seemed normal. The apartment looked the same as it had when I first arrived. Sleek, modern, and empty of any flowers. The smell of roses was gone, as though it had never been there. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that lingered from the night before. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I spent the day out again, trying to keep busy. When I returned that evening, I half expected the smell to be gone for good. But as soon as I stepped inside the apartment, it hit me. Faint at first, but growing stronger the longer I stayed inside. This time, the smell was overpowering. I searched the apartment one last time, feeling like I had to know the source. I checked the air vents, pulled out all the furniture, and even looked behind the refrigerator. But still, there was nothing. It wasn't until the final night, when I was packing up to leave, that I heard something from the host. When I checked out, the host seemed almost hesitant. They mentioned that the apartment had once belonged to a woman who had loved roses. She had lived there alone for years, pouring herself into her garden and filling the apartment with her favorite flower. The host said she passed away peacefully in her sleep several years ago, and it was rumored that, on the night she died, the smell of roses was so strong in the apartment that it had filled the entire building. I froze. I didn't know how to respond. It didn't make any sense. The host's voice was calm, but there was an undertone, something that made me uncomfortable. They didn't say much more about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the apartment held some sort of memory, a trace left behind. I left, feeling relieved to finally be away from the place. But as I walked out the door and down the hall, I couldn't help but feel like I had been followed, like there was something still there, just behind me, lingering in the air. For days after, I couldn't escape the smell of roses. It was faint, like a memory stuck to the back of my mind. Even now, whenever I catch a whiff of roses, I get a chill. It's like something is reminding me of that apartment, of the corner where the shadow stood, and the smell that wouldn't let me go. I don't know if it was just my mind playing tricks, or something more strange, but I'll never forget that smell. It followed me long after I left that apartment behind. It was the kind of trip I had been looking forward to for months. A short, work-related visit to a city I'd never been to before. I had some free time, so I decided to make the most of it, explore a little, and maybe get some inspiration for my next big project. When I found the townhouse on Airbnb, I knew it was perfect. The photos online were stunning. Tall windows, ornate furniture, high ceilings, and a history that seemed to seep from every corner. The host seemed welcoming enough, and the reviews were glowing. It was the kind of place that promised an escape from the usual bland hotel rooms I usually stayed in during work trips. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already starting to dip behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the narrow streets. The townhouse sat at the end of a quiet block, surrounded by other old, well-maintained buildings, all with their own character. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt the weight of history in the air. The front door creaked closed behind me, and I was greeted by a musty scent that somehow felt comforting. The walls were lined with heavy wood paneling, and the floors creaked underfoot as if the house itself were speaking to me. The host, a woman in her late 50s, showed me around. She was pleasant but seemed a little distracted, like her mind was elsewhere. "This place has been in the family for generations," she said, gesturing to the high-backed chairs and the polished antique tables scattered throughout the rooms. "We've tried to keep it as original as possible. It's not for everyone, but I think you'll appreciate it." I nodded, admiring the beautiful craftsmanship in the furniture and the intricate molding on the ceilings. But there was something that caught my eye almost immediately. At the end of the long hallway, tucked behind a velvet curtain, was a door. It was different from the others. While the rest of the house looked aged, elegant, even a little tired, this door was painted a deep, unsettling blood red. It looked newer than anything else in the house, and the paint was still fresh, almost as though it had been done recently. I tried to ignore it, but the door drew my attention like a magnet. Something about it didn't fit. I could tell that the host noticed me staring at it because she glanced over, but didn't offer any explanation. Finally, I couldn't hold back any longer and asked, "What's behind that door?" The host's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, that's just an old closet we've never gotten around to removing. Nothing special," she said quickly, brushing it off like it was no big deal. I wasn't convinced, but I nodded and followed her upstairs to show me the rest of the townhouse. That night, after a long day of meetings and city exploration, I found myself back in the townhouse, exhausted. The place had a strange feeling, quiet, almost too quiet. The air was still, and there was no hum of city noise like I'd expected. I climbed into bed, the sheets cold and crisp, and tried to settle in. It was an old house, and I could hear the typical noises, the occasional groan of the wood settling, the rattle of pipes somewhere deep inside the walls. But then, something changed. I was just about to drift off when I heard it. A sharp, metallic sound, like a door handle turning. I froze, wide awake. My heart beat faster as I strained my ears. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Click, 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 like someone was twisting the knob on that blood-red door at the end of the hallway. I held my breath, listening. The door was locked. I was certain of it. The host had said it was just an unused closet, after all. But still, the rattling continued, getting louder, more persistent. My mind raced as I sat up in bed. I didn't want to go check, but I couldn't ignore it. What if someone was in there? What if it wasn't locked? What if... I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet hitting the cold wood of the floor. I moved quietly, my pulse thudding in my ears as I crept out into the hallway. The door was still rattling, that low metallic noise grating on my nerves. My hand hovered just above the doorknob as I reached for it, but as soon as I touched the cold brass, the rattling stopped. For a moment, everything was silent, too silent. I stood there, my fingers still resting on the knob, my mind racing. The door was locked, and there was no way anything could have gotten through it. But then why had I heard it? Why had it been rattling like that? I pulled my hand away slowly, my mind screaming at me to turn around and go back to bed. I didn't open the door. I didn't want to. Something told me it wasn't a good idea, and I wasn't sure why. But I could feel my body tense, as though whatever was on the other side of that door was watching me. The night was restless after that. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the strange unease that had settled over me. I kept thinking about the door. I kept hearing that rattling sound, even though it had stopped when I touched the handle. It was as if something was still trying to get through, something hidden behind that red door, just waiting for me to open it. The next morning, I woke early, determined to shake off the strange feeling from the night before. I grabbed my coffee and tried to focus on work, but my mind kept wandering. I found myself glancing down the hallway more often than I wanted to admit, my eyes always drawn to the blood-red door at the end. But when I finally mentioned it to the host, her reaction was strange. "Oh, it must have just been the wind," she said quickly, avoiding my gaze. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. There was something off about her, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She didn't seem like herself, and when I asked her about the rattling, she changed the subject. I let it go. After all, I had to get to work, and I couldn't dwell on it forever. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't just the door, it was the way the house felt. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that I was being watched even when I was alone. By the time I left the townhouse to head to the airport, I was ready to put it all behind me. But as I walked out the door, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The blood-red door was slightly ajar. I froze. The door had been closed when I came in this morning. I was sure of it, but now it was open just a crack. Not wide enough for someone to slip through, but wide enough to make my skin crawl. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, staring at it. Had someone been inside? Had they opened it while I was in the shower or out exploring the city? I shook my head and forced myself to look away. I couldn't stay here any longer, not with that door staring at me, beckoning me to open it. I grabbed my bag and left, the door still slightly ajar behind me. As I made my way down the stairs, out the door, and into the cool city air, the flight back home was uneventful, but the feeling that had settled over me in that townhouse stayed with me. For days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The door, the rattling, the host's strange behavior. I'd stayed in plenty of places before, but this one had unsettled me more than I cared to admit. I never went back to that townhouse. Not because of the door, not because of the strange noises, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That door wasn't just a closet. It wasn't just an old feature of the house. There was something behind it, something that wanted to be found, something that would have to wait for someone else to open it, because I wasn't going to be the one to find out. I had been planning this getaway for weeks, a break from the city, a weekend escape to recharge. When I found the listing on Airbnb, I was immediately taken by the photos of a charming Victorian house tucked away in a quiet, sleepy neighborhood. The house looked like it had been lifted straight from a postcard, with its white painted exterior, the overgrown ivy crawling up the side, and the classic wraparound porch. It promised an experience of tranquility, an escape from the hustle of daily life. When I pulled up to the house, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden light over the neighborhood. The air smelled fresh, like rain was coming, though the sky was still clear. I parked my car in the driveway and walked up to the door, which was already open, as the host had assured me she would be away for a while and the key would be waiting for me inside. The house was exactly what I had hoped for. It was cozy, yet large enough to give you space to breathe. The living room had a vintage couch, a heavy oak coffee table, and a fireplace that looked like it had not been used in years, but still managed to add a sense of warmth to the room. Everywhere you looked, there was something charming: old family photos in black frames on the walls, a crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling, and little trinkets that made it feel lived in, but not too much. There was a definite sense of care about the place. The floors creaked underfoot in that comforting, nostalgic way that only old houses do. I had unpacked my bag and was starting to settle in when I noticed something odd. At the far end of the hallway, there was a door. It looked just like any other door in the house, painted white with a brass knob. But what made it different was that it was locked. I was surprised by how much it bothered me. Everything else about the house was so perfect, so inviting, and yet there was something unsettling about that door. I tried to shake it off. The host had mentioned that the house had been in her family for generations, so maybe it was just a room that was off limits for some reason. But still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The more I walked past it, the more it tugged at my curiosity. There was something about it that didn't sit right. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of fresh coffee drifting in from the kitchen. I got out of bed, stretched, and made my way downstairs. On the kitchen counter was a small key, and next to it, a note written in neat handwriting, "For the room." My heart skipped a beat. The key had to be for the locked door. It was almost as if the host had anticipated my curiosity, and now she was inviting me to find out what lay behind it. I felt a rush of excitement, but also a wave of unease. Part of me wanted to leave the door closed, to ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. But the other part of me, the curious part, the part that was always drawn to mysteries, couldn't resist. I picked up the key and walked back down the hallway toward the door. The moment I turned the key in the lock, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The door creaked open slowly, as if it hadn't been moved in years. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. The curtains were drawn, and the only light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The room smelled musty, like old books and dust. It was different from the rest of the house. There was an almost oppressive silence to it. My gaze landed on the bed in the center of the room. It was large, but covered in a dark, worn blanket that looked like it had seen better days. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw them. Photographs. Stacks of black and white photographs were piled up on the bed, each one crinkled at the edges, faded with age. I stepped closer to the bed, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The photographs were of people, strangers to me, but perhaps they had once stayed in this house. They looked like ordinary folks, but there was something wrong about them. Some of them smiled, though the smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. Others looked gaunt, sickly even, their faces pale as if they had seen something they couldn't forget. I picked up one of the photos and held it closer to my face. It was a woman, probably in her late 30s, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned gown. She stared directly into the camera, her eyes hollow and dark, her mouth twisted into a grimace. I couldn't look away from her gaze. It felt like she was staring at me, not through the photograph, but directly into my soul. My hand trembled slightly as I set the photograph back down. I began to feel a sense of unease growing in my chest, but I couldn't stop myself from looking through more of the photographs. Some were of families, some of single individuals, all captured in moments that should have been happy, but there was an underlying sense of dread in every face. The further I dug into the pile, the more unsettling it became. Every face seemed to carry a weight of sadness or fear, but it was the last photograph that made my stomach drop. It was of a man, or at least I thought it was a man. His features were sharp and angular, his eyes wide and unblinking. His mouth twisted in a way that almost looked like a smile but wasn't. It wasn't the way he looked that terrified me, though. It was the fact that in the background, barely visible behind him, there was a figure standing in the shadows. The figure was blurry, but it looked like it was watching him, or perhaps me. I stepped back from the bed, my heart pounding in my chest. Couldn't breathe. The room felt smaller now, suffocating even, and I had an overwhelming urge to get out, to leave this place and never come back. But as I turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, my heart racing as I tried to turn the knob, but it was stuck. I could feel my pulse thundering in my ears as I pulled harder, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic began to rise in my chest, and I pounded on the door with both fists, shouting for help even though I knew no one would hear me. The house was too quiet, too still. My mind raced. The lock, the key. I had to get back to the key. I fumbled in my pockets, but it wasn't there. It had fallen out somewhere, probably on the bed, among the photographs. The room felt colder now, and I could hear something faint, like whispering, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I began to feel a sharp sense of claustrophobia, my breaths becoming shallow and rapid as I searched for a way out. I grabbed the knob again, pulling with all my strength, and this time it gave way. The door opened with a soft groan, and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. I ran through the house, out the front door, and into the fresh air. I didn't stop until I was at the end of the driveway, where I paused to catch my breath. I turned back to look at the house, but the front door was now shut, and all the windows were dark. I never went back into that room. I packed my things, left the key on the kitchen counter, and drove away without a second thought. To this day, I have no idea what I stumbled upon in that room or who the people in those photographs were. I don't know if they were guests of the house or something more sinister, but I do know one thing: whatever was behind that door was not meant for me to see. I don't know if it was the house itself or something else entirely, but I don't think I'll ever forget that feeling, that cold, suffocating sense of something watching me from the shadows. I had been traveling for days, driving along highways with no clear destination in mind. The plan had been to take a short break, find a quiet place to rest, and continue on. I didn't expect much when I made a last-minute booking for an Airbnb in a rural area. The host's profile was simple. The house looked decent in the photos, old but not too bad. It seemed perfect for a quiet, restful night. I was getting tired, and I didn't want to risk a long drive after dark, so I booked it without thinking too much. When I arrived, the house seemed just like the photos. It was a bit old-fashioned, sure, but clean enough. The house was tucked away in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by tall trees and rolling fields. It felt far from the noise of the city, and for that I was grateful. I'd been craving some peace, a break from the constant rush of daily life. The driveway was long, gravel crunching under my tires as I pulled up to the house. The building was 2 stories, with faded white paint and a porch that seemed like it had seen better days. There was no sign of the host, but the key was in the lockbox, and the instructions were clear. The front door creaked when I opened it, the wood old and worn. I stepped inside. The inside of the house had that musty smell, the kind that comes with age, but it was nothing too alarming. The floors creaked as I walked through the hallway, and I noticed the furniture was a bit dated. Nothing extravagant, just a couple of couches and a few old lamps scattered around. The kitchen had that old farmhouse feel, with dishes left in the drying rack and the hum of a fridge in the corner. The place was tidy, though, and that was all that mattered to me. After settling in, I decided to make dinner. I wasn't in the mood to go anywhere, so I cooked something simple. The small TV in the living room was my only company as I ate, flicking through channels mindlessly. There was nothing on, but I didn't mind. It felt good to be alone, to not have to talk to anyone or worry about anything. I had planned to just relax for the night, maybe watch a movie before heading to bed early. But as I got into bed and the house grew quieter, I started to feel a bit uneasy. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive. It wasn't like the city, where there was always some background noise. Here, everything was still. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. I pushed the feeling aside, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place, the way it felt so isolated. I had been driving for hours, and I was exhausted. Sleep would help. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound that made my heart race immediately. A soft tapping on the window. It was so faint at first that I thought it was just the wind. But then it came again, louder this time, like fingers lightly scratching against the glass. My eyes snapped open, and for a few moments, I just lay there, confused. My grogginess made it hard to process what was happening. It was so quiet, so still, that the sound felt unnaturally loud. I blinked in the darkness, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch brushing against the window, but the tapping didn't stop. Kept going, rhythmic and deliberate. I was frozen for a second, my heart pounding in my chest. The logical part of my brain told me it was just the wind or some animal outside. But something about the sound felt off, like it was too purposeful. I finally forced myself to sit up, my legs heavy as I swung them over the side of the bed. The house creaked in the silence, and I felt a cold draft brushing against my skin. My breath came out in short, quick gasps. I padded softly across the room, trying to keep my movements as quiet as possible, unsure of what I might find. The room was dim, the only light coming from the faint glow of a street lamp outside. The tapping came again, and I was now sure that it wasn't the wind. This was something else. I reached the window, pulling the curtains back just enough to peek outside. The night was darker than I expected. I squinted, trying to make out any shapes in the darkness. There was nothing there, no animal, no wind-blown branch, nothing. I stepped back from the window, confused and more than a little unsettled. But as I turned to move away, the tapping came again, louder this time, like someone was knocking at the glass. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stood there, staring at the window, not sure what to do. There was a sense of urgency in the tapping now, something almost demanding. I didn't want to look outside again. I didn't want to see whatever it was that was making that sound. But my curiosity, or maybe my fear, pushed me to pull the curtains back just a little more. And that's when I saw him, an old man, standing right outside the window, his face pressed against the glass. He was staring at me with wide, hollow eyes, and his expression was unsettlingly still. His face was pale, his skin almost sickly looking, and his hair was thin and gray, sticking out in odd angles. He didn't blink, didn't move a muscle. He just stood there, staring into the room with that unblinking gaze. His hands were pressed against the window, fingers spread out like he was trying to get closer, as if he was trapped and trying to make contact. I felt a chill run down my spine, a surge of panic flooding my body. I stumbled back from the window, my pulse racing. My legs felt weak, like I couldn't stand, like the ground was suddenly unsteady beneath me. I slammed the blinds shut, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in around me. I locked the window, my hands trembling, but even as I did, I couldn't shake the image of that old man, his face pressed against the glass. I couldn't get the image of his eyes out of my head. I glanced back at the window, my mind screaming at me to look away, but I couldn't. I had to know. The blinds were shut tight, but my eyes still lingered on the spot where I had seen him. The silence in the room was deafening, every creak of the house feeling like a threat, like the walls were moving in on me. I half expected to see him standing there again, staring at me with that same expression. But when I looked again, he was gone. The night was silent, eerily so. The tapping had stopped. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The logical part of me told me it must have been a trick of the light, some weird reflection. But my gut told me something different. Something wasn't right. There was no way that man had been standing outside my window without me hearing him approach. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, and the more I thought about it, the less sure I was of anything. I couldn't sleep after that. My mind wouldn't let me. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew I couldn't explain what I had seen. I kept thinking about the old man's eyes, how empty they had been. It felt like he was waiting for something, like he was trying to tell me something without speaking. It haunted me, kept me awake through the rest of the night. The next morning, I was exhausted, my nerves still raw from the night before. I decided I needed to leave. I couldn't stay another night in that house, not after what I had seen. I packed up my things in a haze, barely paying attention to what I was doing. My mind kept going back to that window, to that man's face. I was ready to get the hell out of there. As I was about to leave, I sent a quick message to the host to let them know I would be checking out early. I didn't expect much of a response, but when I received a reply, it wasn't what I expected. The host apologized for the inconvenience and casually mentioned that the house had once belonged to an elderly man who had passed away some years ago. I had no idea what to say to that. Was it just a coincidence? Maybe, but part of me didn't believe that. I didn't know if the host was just telling me that to explain away the weirdness, or if they truly didn't know about the strange events that had happened in that house before. I never went back to that place. I don't know if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or if there was something more to it. But every time I close my eyes, I see that man's face, his hollow eyes staring back at me through the window. And I'll never forget that feeling, the feeling of being watched, even when I was alone. I had been looking forward to my weekend getaway for weeks. I'd found a loft apartment in a trendy part of the city that seemed like the perfect spot to escape the grind of work. The listing was beautiful modern furniture, sleek appliances, and large floor-to-ceiling windows with views of the skyline. The apartment was decorated with minimalist style, full of bright whites, dark woods, and clean lines. It was everything I'd been hoping for. When I arrived, I couldn't help but smile as I walked inside. The place was spotless, and the soft, ambient lighting made it feel warm and welcoming. The host had mentioned that there was a vintage mirror above the fireplace, and when I spotted it, I had to admit, it was impressive. An old, ornate golden frame, intricate designs around the edges, and a sheen that made it look like it had been pulled from a museum. It was stunning. It added character to the room, a piece that seemed almost out of place amid the modern furniture, but it fit in perfectly nonetheless. I admired it for a moment, took in the entire apartment, and then set my bags down. I figured I would enjoy a peaceful night alone in this chic, quiet space. That evening, I settled in with some takeout, turned on the TV, and scrolled through my phone. The place was perfect for relaxing. I hadn't planned to do much. I was just happy to be somewhere new, somewhere quiet. The apartment had a nice, quiet ambience that made it easy to forget about everything else. As I sat on the couch, I kept finding myself glancing at the mirror. It was almost as if something was drawing my attention to it. Maybe it was the antique style, maybe it was just because it was so out of place in an otherwise modern apartment. But I kept catching myself staring at it for long periods. It wasn't anything specific, it just felt strange. The reflection seemed to shift slightly, as if it were showing me something other than what was actually in the room. The first few times, I brushed it off as nothing. I turned my head away, and it would feel normal again. But as the night wore on, something started to make me feel uneasy. I'd glance up, and the mirror would reflect the room, sure, but the angles just weren't right. I couldn't explain it. The reflection of the furniture seemed to be off. The shadows were deeper than they should have been, and the lines of the room didn't match perfectly. Around 2 a.m., I was still awake, a little tired, and ready to get some sleep. But there I was, still on my phone, scrolling mindlessly. I looked up one more time at the mirror, and that's when I froze. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, but no, it was clear. In the reflection, there was a figure standing in the doorway, a shadowy figure that didn't belong. I stared at it, my heart sinking into my stomach. It wasn't like the room I was sitting in at all. I could feel my blood run cold. The figure was standing there, in the hallway just outside the living room, looking toward the space I was in. But when I turned to look directly at the doorway, it was empty. There was no one there. I didn't know what to think. I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, unmoving. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. It didn't go away. There was a shadow, tall and thin, standing in the same spot. But nothing in the room had changed. The reflection was wrong, though. The angle didn't match. I knew it, even though I couldn't put my finger on how. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was something else. I felt panic rising in my chest. My hands started to tremble. I had to get up, get out of there, but I couldn't move. I stayed frozen, staring at the reflection. I wanted to turn on the lights, but the thought of walking toward that mirror, toward that figure, was terrifying. My mind raced with thoughts I didn't want to entertain. Was I imagining it? Was this some kind of trick? Maybe it was the mirror. Maybe it was something about the way the light hit it or the way I was sitting. But everything in me screamed that something was wrong. I jumped up from the couch and walked quickly to the doorway, my pulse pounding in my ears. I looked down the hallway, and the space was completely empty. No shadow, no figure. The apartment was silent, and everything seemed normal. I felt foolish. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, right? Maybe I was tired, or maybe the long hours at work had caught up with me. But I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I walked back to the couch, grabbed my phone, and messaged the host immediately. I didn't expect an immediate reply. It was past 2 a.m. after all, but I felt the need to reach out. I explained what had happened, what I'd seen in the mirror. I didn't know what I wanted from them. Maybe some reassurance, maybe an explanation. I mentioned the figure in the doorway and how the reflection didn't match the actual room. I didn't want to sound like I was overreacting, but I couldn't just sit there and pretend nothing had happened. Minutes passed, then an hour. No response. I tried to lie back down, but sleep was impossible. I kept imagining that shadowy figure, standing just outside the living room. I kept thinking that if I turned around again, it would be there, waiting. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. Eventually, around 5 a.m., the host replied. Their message was short. The mirror has been there for decades. It's not unusual for it to cast strange reflections due to the angle of the room. That was it. No real explanation, nothing to reassure me. I felt more unsettled than ever. What did they mean by strange reflections? Was this something that had happened before? Was I the only one who had noticed it? I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, I woke up to bright sunlight streaming in through the windows, and for a moment, I tried to push everything out of my mind. The mirror was still there, though, and despite the daylight, it still looked wrong. I tried to get a grip. I was in a nice apartment in a city I'd been wanting to explore. I shouldn't let one weird experience ruin my trip. But something about that mirror, and what I'd seen the night before, made it hard to let go. I decided to check out early. Maybe I just needed to get out of there and go for a walk, clear my head, and leave the weirdness behind me. I packed my things, took one last look at the apartment, and walked toward the door. As I turned the corner to head out, I noticed something strange. The mirror was gone. It wasn't there. The empty space above the fireplace looked bare. There was no mirror hanging there anymore. I stood still for a moment, wondering if I was imagining it. I walked back toward the fireplace and looked at the wall, just to make sure I wasn't seeing things. No mirror, just a clean, empty wall where it had been only hours before. I couldn't make sense of it. The host had told me it had been there for decades, yet it was gone now without a trace. There wasn't even any mark on the wall where it had been hanging. It was like the mirror had never existed. I left the apartment without saying a word to the host. I didn't feel the need to ask about the mirror or its sudden disappearance. The whole situation had made me feel uneasy, and I didn't want to dig into it any further. The rest of the day was fine. I walked around the city, tried to shake off the feeling of discomfort, and explored the streets I had come to see. But I couldn't stop thinking about that mirror and the strange, unsettling feeling I'd had while staring into it. I still couldn't explain what had happened, and part of me didn't want to. I tried to tell myself that I had imagined it all, that I had gotten too caught up in my own head. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew that the reflection hadn't matched the room, and I knew the figure had been there in the mirror. As I boarded my flight home the next day, I glanced out the window at the city below. I'd never stay in an Airbnb again without really checking the place out, and I'd never forget that mirror. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. Just me, the mountains, and some peace and quiet away from the never-ending buzz of city life. I needed a break, something to clear my head. So when I found this small, rustic cabin on Airbnb, I jumped at the chance. It looked like something out of a postcard, charming, tucked away, surrounded by the dense woods of the Appalachian Mountains. The listing promised a secluded retreat, a place to unwind and disconnect. Exactly what I needed. The drive up to the cabin was peaceful, the kind of drive where the world feels quieter as you leave the chaos behind. The roads wound up into the mountains, the trees becoming thicker and the air fresher as I ascended. When I finally arrived, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The cabin was everything I imagined. Wooden, cozy, with a stone chimney curling out smoke into the chilly air. The host had left the key in a lockbox, so there was no need for a formal greeting. I let myself in and stood in the doorway for a moment, just taking it all in. Inside, the cabin was simple but beautifully arranged. A stone fireplace stood against one wall, crackling with a fire that gave off warmth and a soft orange glow. The kitchen was small but fully stocked, with old, wooden cabinets that creaked when you opened them. The wooden floors felt solid beneath my feet, the kind of floors that didn't squeak with every step. The air smelled of wood and the faintest trace of pine. It was the smell of being completely isolated, away from everything and everyone. I unpacked my things and settled into the living room. I made myself a cup of tea and watched the fire, listening to the gentle pops and crackles of the wood burning. The mountains outside were blanketed in a soft, evening fog, adding to the stillness that surrounded me. It was the kind of peace I hadn't experienced in years. The noise of the city felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. I felt my shoulders relax, the tension from work and life slipping away. As night fell, the silence grew deeper. I threw another log on the fire, made sure the door was locked, and turned off the lights, leaving only the soft glow of the flames. I couldn't remember the last time I'd been in a place this quiet. No cars, no honking horns, no conversations from neighbors. just the whisper of the wind through the trees and the crackle of the fire. I settled into bed, the soft sheets wrapping around me like a cocoon. It wasn't long before I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the rhythmic sound of the fire and the stillness of the night. But then, around 3 a.m., I was woken by a sound. At first, it was so soft that I thought I was imagining it. A faint, distant hum, almost like the wind. I tried to ignore it, turning my head into the pillow, hoping I could fall back asleep. But the sound wouldn't go away. It wasn't the wind, not anymore. It was a woman's voice, soft and melodic, singing a lullaby. The song was haunting, filled with a sadness that made my chest tighten. It was beautiful, but it made me feel uneasy, like it was too pure for this world. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the wind, or maybe an animal calling out in the distance. But the longer I lay there, the more the voice seemed to grow, getting louder and closer. It wasn't right, felt wrong, like something I shouldn't be hearing. The lullaby was repetitive, and each time it came back, the sorrow in the voice grew more palpable, more intense. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I was wide awake now, eyes darting around the dark room. There was no mistaking it. The voice was getting closer. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. There was someone outside, singing, and the song was too eerie to ignore. I couldn't just stay in bed. I had to check. I grabbed my jacket, slipped on my boots, and made my way out of the cabin, my breath visible in the cold night air. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the woods, and the song still echoed in the distance, like a lullaby drifting through the trees. I stood still for a moment, trying to locate the source of the sound, but there was nothing. The woods were empty, bathed in that eerie, moonlit glow. No sign of life anywhere. The song stopped as soon as I stepped onto the porch, and the silence that followed was deafening. I stood frozen, staring out into the woods. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing. The only sound now was my own breathing and the distant rustling of the trees in the cold wind. I locked the door behind me and went back inside, my mind racing. I didn't know what to make of it, but my nerves were on edge. The calm I'd felt earlier had vanished, replaced by a growing sense of unease. I couldn't sleep after that. I stayed up all night, sitting on the couch, eyes darting to the windows every time the wind moved the trees. Every creak of the house made my heart jump. The fire had burned low, and the warmth from it no longer seemed to offer comfort. I kept expecting to hear that lullaby again, but it never came. I don't know if I was relieved or disappointed. It was like the silence was worse than the song. When morning came, I was exhausted. The sun had risen over the mountains, casting light over the cabin, but I still felt on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened, something I didn't understand. I didn't know if I'd imagined the song or if it was real, but it didn't matter. Felt too real. I decided to ask the host about it when I returned the key. Maybe she could offer some explanation, something to ease my mind. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for, but I felt like I needed to know. When I walked into the small shop where the host worked, she greeted me with a warm smile. I handed over the key, but I couldn't help myself. I had to ask. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is this place haunted?" She laughed lightly, shaking her head. "Oh no, no ghosts here." She paused for a moment, a strange look crossing her face before she added, "But something happened here a long time ago." I was intrigued now. "What do you mean?" She leaned in a little, lowering her voice. "There was a woman who used to live here many years ago. She was troubled. She would sing every night, a lullaby like the one you described. It was a sad song, one she sang over and over again. People said she was losing her mind, but no one really knew for sure. Then one night she disappeared. No one ever saw her again." I felt my stomach drop. What happened to her? The host hesitated, looking away. "We don't know. She just vanished, like she was never here. Her things were left behind, the house was still in order. But the singing, people say it still happens sometimes." I never told anyone about it, but she trailed off, her voice barely a whisper. I stood there, the weight of her words sinking in. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some supernatural force. It was just a story, a tragedy, maybe. The woman who had lived there, the one who had sung that haunting lullaby, had been suffering, and her pain had lingered in the walls of the cabin long after she was gone. It wasn't a ghost. It was the echoes of her madness, a part of the place that refused to fade. I left the shop feeling a mix of relief and unease. The mystery wasn't solved, but it was clearer now. I had been spooked by something that wasn't paranormal, but real in its own way. I don't know if the lullaby was just my mind playing tricks or if the house truly carried the sorrow of the woman who had once lived there. But I left with a sense of closure, knowing that the strange events weren't born of fantasy. They were the residue of something tragic, something real, that had happened long before I arrived. I didn't go back to the cabin that night. I had enough of the mountains, of the quiet, of the eerie lullaby that still echoed in my mind. It wasn't a ghost that haunted the place. It was the sadness of a woman who had vanished, leaving only her song behind, and that was enough for me to never return. It was supposed to be a perfect getaway. I had been feeling burnt out from work and the constant buzz of social media, so I decided to book a week in a secluded farmhouse. A little isolation, no distractions, just me and my dog, Max. He was a golden retriever, a bit on the older side, but still playful and loyal. We both needed this break, especially after the crazy few months I'd been through. The farmhouse was about a 2-hour drive away from the nearest town, deep in the country where the only sound was the wind and the occasional rustle of trees. I pulled up to the house late in the afternoon, the long shadows from the setting sun stretching over the worn gravel driveway. The farmhouse was old, but charming. It had a certain character with its faded paint, the wraparound porch, and the steep roof that seemed to be sagging under the weight of years. But there was something comforting about it too. The kind of place you imagined being tucked away from the chaos of the world. Max was already eager to explore, pulling on his leash as I unlocked the door. I stepped inside, and the air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The floors creaked under my feet, and the place felt colder than I expected, despite the warm weather outside. I made my way through the house, noting the wide open spaces, the worn furniture, and the faint smell of something like lavender coming from the upstairs rooms. The host had left a welcome note on the kitchen counter, alongside a bottle of wine and some homemade cookies. It felt homey, and I immediately started to relax. The house had 2 stories. I chose the guest room upstairs for the views. It overlooked a vast field that stretched for miles. The windows were wide, letting in a soft, golden light as the sun set. Max immediately jumped onto the bed, curling up in his usual spot beside me. I opened the window to let in some fresh air, and then unpacked my things. The first night went by without incident. The only sounds I heard were the chirping of crickets outside and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, just what I needed. But then, things started to change on the second night. I had just finished watching a movie on my laptop, and Max was curled up beside me, snoring softly. The house was quiet, and I was getting ready to go to bed when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps above me. They weren't my own. I knew the sound of my own footsteps, and I knew Max's too. These were heavy, slow steps, like someone was walking deliberately around the room above me. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, listening closely. The footsteps continued for a few moments, then stopped. A long silence followed, and I tried to shake off the unease settling in my chest. I chalked it up to the house settling. After all, it was old, and old houses make noises. I had heard that much before. I checked the window, thinking perhaps someone had come by, but the field outside was dark, empty. There was no sign of anyone. Max stirred beside me, sensing my unease. I tried to calm him down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, listening for any more sounds, but nothing came. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, though not without an uncomfortable knot in my stomach. The next night, it happened again. The footsteps were louder this time, as if the person, or whatever it was walking directly above me, pacing back and forth. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, listening. It wasn't like the creaks you get from old houses. These were purposeful steps, like someone was walking in the room above, moving from one end to the other. Max growled low in his throat, clearly unsettled by the sound. I waited, hoping it would stop. Didn't. I jumped out of bed and made my way to the door, stepping cautiously down the creaky hallway to the stairs. I crept up the stairs, every step making the wood groan beneath me. But when I reached the top, the upstairs hallway was empty. The rooms were all dark, and the air felt strangely cold. I checked every room, nothing. No one was up there, but the footsteps, they continued, slow, heavy, one after the other, as if someone was pacing across the floor directly above my head. At this point, I wasn't sure what to think. Maybe it was animals. Maybe there was something going on with the house, but it didn't feel right. I kept Max close to me, and we stayed in the guest room for the rest of the night, but I barely slept. I kept my ears tuned for any more sounds, but the house was eerily silent after that. By the time the third night rolled around, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The footsteps were getting louder. There was no denying it now. Someone or something was walking around up there. It felt like it was right above me, as though they were right there in the room, walking, stopping, and pacing. I had to know what was going on. The unease was building up inside me, a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I needed answers. The next day, I spoke to the host. Her name was Susan, and she was friendly when we first met. She had welcomed me with a warm smile and gave me the keys to the house with a detailed guide about the area. I had to ask her about the noises, those footsteps. I couldn't hold it in any longer. I explained what had been happening, and she paused for a moment before answering. The house had been vacant for years before I bought it, she said. No one's lived in that upstairs area for a long time. Her voice trembled slightly, and I could tell she was trying to sound casual, but there was something in her eyes. It's probably just the house settling. Old houses do that. I nodded, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But it's so deliberate, I said, not quite believing my own words. It sounds like someone is walking. She laughed, but it was forced. Well, old houses creak and groan. It's just the way things are. She seemed to want to change the subject, and I let her. I left the conversation feeling unsettled, but I tried to push it to the back of my mind. The last thing I wanted was to overthink things. That night, the footsteps returned. They were louder now, more pronounced, as though someone was deliberately pacing back and forth. And then there was another sound, a low creaking, like the floorboards bending under weight. My heart raced. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't just walking. They were moving. The sound of pacing continued for what felt like hours. I lay there, frozen, trying to convince myself that it was just the house settling. But it didn't feel like that. It felt intentional, deliberate, as though I was being watched. My skin prickled, and I pulled the blankets tightly around me, but no amount of warmth could shake the chill that had settled in my bones. By the time the fifth night came, I was on edge. The footsteps had become almost rhythmic, as if whoever was upstairs had no intention of stopping. I stayed in bed, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The sound came again, slow, heavy footsteps pacing from one side of the room to the other. I didn't dare get up to check. I didn't want to know, but I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, and then the creaking started again. It was more distinct now, like someone was shifting their weight on the floorboards, moving back and forth as if they were pacing in circles. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I felt trapped. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't animals. It was something else, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I spent the rest of the night in a state of paralysis, waiting for the sounds to stop, but they never did. When morning came, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. I checked out of the Airbnb that morning without a word to the host. I didn't want to know what was going on. I just wanted to leave. I never spoke to Susan again, and I never returned to that farmhouse. I don't know what was making those sounds, and part of me doesn't want to know. I left the place with a feeling of unease that has never quite gone away. To this day, whenever I hear footsteps in an empty house, I remember that feeling, the heavy, deliberate steps above me, and I wonder if the house was truly empty after all.